So some of the presentations already discussed intergenerational transmission. You see behavior in parents as well as in children. And as we discussed today, as many people discuss, that these kids who have imprisoned parents, but also kids of convicted parents, I think Nancy mentioned it before, they have an increased risk to commit crime. And what we see with parental imprisonment is that there are two processes that are happening. You can see on one side, it's the parental imprisonment itself, but on the other side, you can see that a criminal parent in itself often poses an additional risk for kids to become criminal. And in my presentation, I'm going to discuss both of these. And I will start with the left one. And maybe you've seen this photo before. It's a kid from Feyenoord, which is a big football club in the Netherlands. And if you see this photo, you start to wonder, why is he doing it? Why is he showing this behavior? Is he imitating his dad or maybe his mom? Or is he just genetically predisposed to be very aggressive? Or are there all these kids around him that do the same? Or did someone annoy him? Or maybe you can think of other questions. So this starts you to think about explanations for intergenerational transmission. And in this case, it's kind of aggressive behavior that we're talking about, but we see intergenerational transmission for lots of different behaviors. You can think about intelligence, you can think about socioeconomic status, demographic behaviors, such as when do you have children, at what age, or do you get married? But today, we're talking mostly about criminal behavior. And when you think about these questions, why does this kid show this behavior? In criminology, we summarize these under 4 headings in a sense. So first, there's, as I mentioned, there is some kind of genetic transmission or biological transmission. And you can think of how impulsive people are. That's partly biologically determined. Some people are just more impulsive than others. Or low resting heart rate, which is related to criminal behavior. If you have a low heart rate, you're more likely to commit crime or to be a sportsman. I actually have a very low heart rate, so I don't commit crime, I think, but I do lots of sports. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you will commit crime, you're just more likely to. And the second explanation for intergenerational transmission is what I mentioned, the imitation of behavior. So children learn certain values from the parents and they see certain behaviors in the home, especially, for example, in domestic violence, and they learn that certain types of behavior are acceptable or normal. And a third explanation, which is clearly related to it, is risk factors in the environment. And we've, in many presentations this morning, people already talked about how these kids grow up in a very negative environment. It's not just the parental imprisonment that's happening. There is substance abuse, maybe they grow up in a bad neighborhood, and then you also have social learning from peers. So children around them might commit crime as well, or they have certain values, and so there's also social learning in the environment. And then the fourth mechanism is something that's not so discussed very often. It's what we call official bias. And official bias basically means that you'll see children of convicted parents in the criminal records more often because criminal justice agencies are biased against these kids. And this can happen on various levels. It can happen in a neighborhood where maybe a police officer knows that these are kids of convicted parents, so they are more likely to be bad, so let's keep an eye on them. And some people could say, well, it's good. If they commit crime, then we should convict them, right? But the problem is that, first of all, it's unfair that these kids are more often convicted. Secondly, involving children and young people in the criminal justice system often leads to more crime. And we've studied this as well in the Cambridge study. And you see that when people are being convicted, afterwards they start to commit more and more crime. So it doesn't help. And so not even if it's unfair, and secondly, it doesn't help. So it's an important issue to talk about. So keeping these mechanisms and explanations in the back of your head, we'll now talk about the second part of the impact of parental imprisonment, which is the parental imprisonment itself. And I don't have to explain much detail about it because many people today did that already. We can think about separation from the parent, collateral consequences such as loss of income, and as I clearly explained, the fact that parents who go to prison are more likely to be more severe criminals in a sense because they committed such acts that they are being sent to prison. So that could be another explanation. And so the question is, does parental imprisonment add an additional risk? And it's also, I think you or Jane talked about Joe Murray's systematic review. And actually, it's the additional impact in that review seemed to be 10%. And so that's what we're going to talk about today as well. If you compare these kids to convicted parents who have not been to prison when the kids were 0 to 18, do kids whose parents have been to prison commit more crime than kids of convicted parents? And the answer is yes, but only in England. We actually did a cross-national research. We used a cross-national design where we compared kids in England versus the Netherlands. And I'm going to explain you a lot more about it. I'll first give you a brief overview of the study we did. In a sense, I'm going to discuss why we used a cross-national design. I'm going to show you that prisoners' sons in England committed more crime, but not in the Netherlands. We're going to talk about the impact of sons' age, the number and the length of imprisonments, and the other error that we discussed before, isn't it just the fact that these kids have more criminal parents? So I said we compared England and the Netherlands. Why would you do such a thing? Well, there are differences between countries, and if you study parental imprisonment, it's hard to disentangle the explanations for it. So, for example, it could be the criminal parent, it could be the separation and the trauma, it could be the loss of income, the social strain because the parent's gone and the other parent has a hard time because the other parent has to do it on his or her own. It could be economic strain I mentioned already. It could also be, this is actually interesting and not so much discussed today, although Caroline mentioned it briefly in her presentation. Sometimes parental imprisonment can be good for kids. And that might sound horrible, but some kids grow up in very disturbing environments. And I've interviewed kids whose mothers went to prison, and some of them said, finally, there's some rest. Finally, I live with my aunt, and we have a very structured life, and it's just better. So that's another explanation why you can expect an impact of imprisonment, although it's the other way around. And related to that, sometimes this is the first time that these very disrupted families come into contact with social support organizations. And so that can be good as well. So, but how are you going to study all these different explanations? How can you know what's happening? Because we can't do an experiment. An experiment would be where we say, especially with intergenerational transmission, that's hard. We say, your parent's criminal, your parent's not. That's not possible. We could do, and in Switzerland they've done this, we could do an experiment in terms of imprisonment. We say, you have committed this type of crime, we're going to flip a coin. If it's one side, you'll be sent to prison. If it's the other side, you get a different sentence, a community sentence or a fine. And this is only possible for people who would have gone to prison anyway, and then it's a better thing if they don't get the prison sentence. But this has only happened a few times in Switzerland, not in the rest of the world yet. So we have to find other ways to study the impact of parental imprisonment. And as I said, a cross-national design is a way to do that, because countries differ in their policies. And we studied England and the Netherlands. after the Second World War, where the Netherlands had an extremely low rate of imprisonment and had very humane and liberal policies. Affordable phone calls, visits were possible. Secondly, the Netherlands is a very small country, so you can't be very far away incarcerated from your family. Whilst England, on the other hand, was much more punitive at the time. The focus was more on punishing, whilst in the Netherlands the focus was on re-socialization. So it's interesting to compare these countries. And also, countries can also differ in the amount of stigmatization for these kids of imprisoned parents. Another example, this is not the Netherlands, but it's Norway, for example. Norway and England, they're geographically not so far away. In England, you probably all know of the murder of James Bulger. He was a kid being killed by other kids, and his murderers were stigmatized. They got so much media attention, and it was everywhere in the papers, everywhere in the media, everyone knew who they were. Compared to Norway, where there was a similar case, and these kids, it was hardly in the media, these kids were carefully shielded from the media, and they also were very carefully reintegrated into society. So this is just an example to show how countries can differ in how much stigmatization occurs. And so for the Netherlands and England, we can think of differences in the support families got in terms of income, financial support, in terms of stigmatization, and also in terms of how easy it was to visit family. And so I gave you the conclusion already, so you know it. As we see, what we see in this graph is we have sons of imprisoned parents, sons of convicted parents. Huge difference. These kids commit twice as much crime as these kids. For daughters, we don't see a difference. In the Netherlands, this is not a significant difference, but it seems to be the opposite. And for daughters in the Netherlands, we also don't see a difference. So you see that in a country where policies were a lot more punitive, sons of prisoners commit way more crime than sons of convicted parents. So we used two comparable groups. All these kids had convicted parents. Just one group, their parents had also been to prison while the kids were between 0 to 18. So then the next question would be, what about how long did the parents go to prison? Did it matter whether a mother or a parent was, or a father was in prison? We didn't find a difference for fathers and mothers, although other studies have shown a difference. We didn't find a difference in terms of the number of crimes committed by the kids. And then I said, does it matter how old the kid is when he goes to prison? And in the previous presentation by Caroline, Jane asked a question about this and said that maybe for older kids, if kids are older, they have often experienced more imprisonments. And so what we see is that the older kids are, the more crime they will commit if their parent has been in prison. So these two groups experience parental imprisonment only either before birth or when the kids were between 0 to 6. This group between 7 and 12, and this group between 13 and 18. And you can start to think of explanations for this. And we think that this might have to do with kids, if they're in their adolescence, they're developing their own personality. And if you're 2, you don't experience the stigmatization, you don't notice that. But if you're 15 and your dad goes to prison, it's much stronger. And that's why we think there is a difference in the impact of parental imprisonment regarding age. Then I talked about the number of parental imprisonments, and you see the same. The more kids experience their parent being sent to prison, the more crime they will commit later on. So you see that there's a cumulative effect. Just 1 or 2 is still bad, but the more they experience this, the more they will commit crime later on. And this will also be related to the environment kids grow up in, because these parents they commit more crime. And The same goes for length of parental imprisonment. The longer parents have been imprisoned, the more crime the kids will commit. And maybe you start to think, but isn't it that these parents are just more criminal then? Because if you're being sent to prison for a longer period, then maybe they've committed a crime that's more severe. Or if they go to prison more often, maybe they commit a crime, or they commit lots of crimes, so maybe there is more intergenerational transmission. And so we wanted to control for this. And what we see is, so this is quite statistical, but I don't know if you know about regression analysis, but basically you can put in predictor variables and you say this is my outcome. And one of our predictors was the number of parental imprisonments and the number of parental convictions. And the outcome is how many convictions the children have. And we see when we add that number of parental convictions, the impact of parental imprisonment decreases. So we know part of this relationship can be explained by how criminal parents are, by how many crimes they have committed. So part of the process that I showed you before, on one side we had parental crime, on one side we had parental imprisonment. It is both these processes. It is partly the fact that these parents have a history of crime related to all the other things, and still it's also the parental imprisonment. And that's important to know. So it's not just parental imprisonment that's doing the harm. It's also these parents being more criminal. And so to summarize it, we found no relationship in the Netherlands. We found a relationship in England, but only for sons, and only when they were older than 7. We found the more imprisonments and the longer they were, the stronger the effect. And this relationship is partly explained by parental criminality. And so then the next question always is, what do we do with this information? How are we going to change this? And I think I would like to, after I've finished, to open up a discussion because I'd like to hear your ideas. And some of the presentations have already mentioned some alternatives. But I just want you to think about some radical solutions. What about if parents are, if a convicted person, if a prisoner is a parent, should we treat them differently? Should we give them a community sentence? Should we have special prisons for them? That's quite radical. Less radical solutions are, luckily in Scotland, I saw yesterday when we went to visit a prison, they happen here already. It's amazing to see. There are amazing children's visits where it's less frightening for the kids to be in prison, to visit their parent. And they can call the parents, and so it's important as well to make sure that phone calls are affordable. Jane was also talking about that. And these are little things. So most importantly is to change the big things. We want to be focusing on rehabilitation instead of just punishing people. But we have to start with the small steps. So we can start with making these phone calls affordable. Why would we want to ask so much money for people making a phone call? That's ridiculous. It just doesn't make sense. Or making these children's visits possible. And it's all these things that will help create a more positive environment where people can still be sentenced for something they do, but they are being sent away to take away their freedom, not to punish them in every way possible, and certainly not to punish the kids. And so I would actually like to ask all of you whether you have any suggestions how we can change this and how we can make sure that the impact of the parental imprisonment itself will be as small as possible.